Carmen. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Erica. I'm happy to be here.
So, I just want to dive right into today's topic. And we have been talking off air a little bit about something you posted a few weeks ago about plyometrics for soccer players. And I think this is such a great discussion because I get a lot of questions on how to train plyometrics in the youth, college, and pro soccer space. And I think there's just a lot of misconceptions surrounding the training. So, do you just want to explain what the post was and then why it was so concerning?
Okay, let me remember. I think it was a post that had a video of some male soccer players doing like a circuit type routine, and they were doing, I think, what could have been assumed plyometrics, but maybe in my categorization, I might not put them in that bucket, but they were certainly giving it their best, but possibly misdirected in what the whole purpose of some of these drills are. And it's really never about, training more frequently or doing more repetitions. It's really always about the quality, just like soccer practice, right? So if you're going to work on things at practice, should be of high quality. Same thing when it comes to movement training. So I think that there's definitely room for some education in how to train the movements that soccer players would need to be proficient at in their sport.
So, yeah, just kind of reflecting back on that post, it was a lot of like light lateral bounds and like mini hurdle hops and just kind of this circus of a bunch of hop and landing drills. So, when we look at the demands of the game, what
Mhm.
are some plyometric drills that soccer players should be training?
It's a great question. So I guess to quickly speak to the demands, they're often shocking when I explain these to kids or to parents that, oftentimes when athletes are coming into a cut, for example, so they have to evade a defender or they're going to cut to the ball, they're moving into that cut at high velocity over a certain distance. So maybe it's 10 meters, 10 yards. And when they put the brakes on to abruptly change direction, especially if that cut is more like a 90-degree cut where they're cutting back to the ball, like 120-degree angles, we're talking like up to 8 times body mass and forces. All right. So if we play tippity tap on an agility ladder, when we're looking down at our feet, we're really not doing very much other than possibly making our feet sore. Every time I watch these videos, I think about, oh my goodness, my feet are cramping just watching because the volume's really high. So meaning they're doing tons and tons of reps, tippity tapping, but there's really not much force going into the ground. And there doesn't seem to be much coaching around head position and eye position, and eye position is actually critical. There's some very good research to support just the amount of brain activity involved when the head is in the right spot and the eyes are looking straight ahead and scanning the field. So, having said that, the best plyometric drills for soccer players, would involve actually a fair amount of variety because soccer players are multi-directional athletes that share space with their opponent. So we don't want to necessarily do the plyos that a high jumper or a hurdler would do in track and field, but we can borrow some of those drills like bounding and skipping, which do have pretty decent levels of force into the ground that'll start to prepare these athletes for the forces they handle in their sport. But we also want to do drills where athletes are moving in multi directions. So doing things like lateral hopping. So hopping on one leg, side to side, like in a zigzag pattern. And at first, maybe sort of sticking the landings and making sure they're holding positions and postures, which are hard for me to explain on a podcast. But, we know that if someone puts on the brakes on one foot and their whole upper body lurches forward, that just shows me that they're lacking strength probably in that movement pattern and need a little bit more refinement, a little bit more practice. The other piece around plyometrics is this idea of equipment. Believe it or not, you don't need any equipment. You could literally just rely on the surface that you're training on. So soccer athletes could start doing their drills on grass and on turf, which is a softer, more absorbent surface, Then later on, or maybe in the off season, could progress to doing some of these drills on rubber surfaces and track surfaces that would actually help to improve the stiffness of their tendons and help to improve the tensile strength of their ligaments throughout their knees and ankles. But that's a progression. That's not where we would necessarily start with a novice. And the last thing I'll mention on the plyometrics is they can be done all year round because they're so skill based. I would actually suggest that, but we're not talking 3 times a week for 45 minutes. These athletes are doing plyometrics. We're talking, let's pick 2 or 3 drills and let's work on them in warm up at soccer practice, a couple of times a week all year. And then we can progress the drills by changing the complexity of the drill and the intensity of the drill. And you might be wondering, well, how do we change the intensity of the drill? Well, it's not by doing tippy tappies faster. By the way, we don't do tippy tappies. Let's imagine the individual's hopping on one foot, because most people can imagine that. By design, the drill will intensify because what will happen is when people get proficient at hopping on one foot, they spend less time on the ground. So by design of that very drill, they will actually get better at the drill, and the drill itself will become more intense. And this is very difficult for people to wrap their head around. So let me give you a sport example. If you had an 8-year-old that was working on penalty kicks, and that 8-year-old was kicking the ball on goal, let's say 20 feet away from that goal, and making it to the net. And then when they were consistent in making that to the net, you would back them up, wouldn't you? You'd move them further away from that goal to eventually wherever they would typically be kicking a penalty kick. Now, forgive me for the sort of crude example, but what I'm trying to illustrate is that as they develop their strength and their kicking skill, which is, part of it's coordination and the other part of it is actual physical strength, then you just back them up further away. Well, the same thing can happen in plyometrics. People that are very plyometric can cover more distance in less hops because they hop higher and further on each hop. But we don't start there. We start with little tiny hops, like looks like we're jumping over or hopping over a credit card. And then eventually we hop a little higher. But the key is that we don't try to hop so high and with so much intensity that we lose our technique and our ability to land in a proper manner, which is in hopping is actually fairly flat-footed. So hopefully that answered your question.
Yes, it does. Now, I want to come back to what you said about the eyes, and I didn't even think about this in
Mhm.
plyometric drills as the position of the eyes and being able to look up and scan and be aware of your surroundings. So if an athlete's doing like a single leg broad jump or a single leg lateral hop, would you recommend that their eyes are forward or do you progress to like looking around? How does that work?
That's a great question. I would, if it's a strict drill, meaning it's just a closed skill drill that we're working on, eyes are up and eyes are straight ahead, like on a focal point in the distance. So I'd say, see that tree way down there? Just focus your eyes on that tree. That just, or will orient their head position. But let's imagine we're doing a drill where we have a leader. So one soccer athlete is leading, say, 4 other players, and they're doing a hopping sequence, like in a square shape. And everybody that's in the group of 4 has to follow that leader. Then the eyes are going to be on that leader. So you're actually focused on a person. So it depends on whether or not we're doing read and react or change of direction type drilling, which is actually agility training, the true definition of agility, or if we end up just drilling the movement pattern and try to get stronger at the movement pattern. Because plyometrics do serve two purposes. One is the coordination piece and the athleticism piece, and the other part is we are trying to make a structural and morphological change to tendons. And so when tendons are stronger, they're stiffer. And stiff doesn't mean not flexible. Okay. It just means that the tendon itself, when it absorbs forces, it doesn't get all squishy and deformed like jello, right? When a tendon is strong and stiff, it's more like plasticine, okay? Or Play-Doh, I think, is the stuff that kids play with. I can't remember. There we go. I just remember the smell of it. Anyway.
And ladder drills definitely don't help with that tendon stiffness. And that's another thing. In the
Yeah.
soccer community, I mean, I see so much of the ladder drills and it's not to say don't do them, but it's also like, well, what's the most bang for buck given the amount of time that we're given with our players? And you said we can just even incorporate plyometrics into warm up and it doesn't have to be this long extended workout because then it defeats the purpose of the plyometric drills. So
Mm.
why do they need to be shorter? Why shouldn't we be doing 45-minute plyometric circuits?
That's a great question. Well, because they're intense, right? They have high levels of what we call ground reaction forces. And so in biomechanics, we can measure how much force goes into the ground if someone's landing like from a vertical movement or say putting on the brakes, which is a horizontal deceleration. So both of those things occur in soccer, right? If an athlete goes up to head the ball, that's a vertical jump, land, right? If an athlete tries to cut to get open and get away from the defender, that's considered a horizontal deceleration. So we want to prepare the athletes for those high forces, but to do that, we also want to make sure that we're not overdoing the volume in the training sessions. So it's a general inverted relationship. The higher the forces, the lower the volume. And so if you did tippy tappy ladder drills, for example, they're low force, high volume, which doesn't necessarily prepare or match the demands of the sport. So if someone chooses to do the ladders, my question would just be why? If they can explain to me the why and the physics behind that, then all the power to them. Now we're not talking 6-year-olds here, right? If we were talking little kids, sure, put a ladder out, have them do some different patterns, just work on basic coordination. So that then the ladder serves a different purpose. It's not about handling ground reaction forces, it's just basic coordination. And it gives them something fun to do. But I still like to get away from the idea of looking down. Okay, so if we're doing those drills on the ladder, please at least have the 6-year-old looking up. And sometimes you can hold up different colored cards and have them yell out the color like blue, red, yellow, or I'll hold my hand up sometimes and just hold my, how many fingers, just because kids habitually, when they're learning something new, we tend to look down. I don't know if it's because we as humans are just shy, and we just tend to do that, or if maybe that's something we do when we're concentrating, when we're trying to learn something, but we do want to keep our heads up. I mean, you don't see basketball players being taught how to dribble with their head down. You don't see soccer players being taught how to dribble with their head down. The coaches will constantly tell them to get their head up. So why would we abandon that cue for other drills that involve coordination?
Coordination's such an interesting concept because I do hear that argument a lot, like, "Oh, well, we whip out the ladder because we just wanna work on coordination," and it's like, well,
Mhm.
is a plyometric drill not coordination? So, let's get into that a
Great
little bit.
point.
I mean, what muscles are firing in something like a single leg broad jump, and can that be considered coordination too?
I think coordination is vague. You're absolutely right. It's contextual, right? So if I can throw a baseball on target, then I have eye-hand coordination. I don't know. Well, what if I can't catch that same baseball? So we're really actually talking about motor skills, I think, at the end of the day. So hopping, leaping, and bounding are all plyometric classifications. So there's 3 types. Well, it usually starts with leaping, which is a 2-foot takeoff to a 2-foot landing, which is the entry point to plyometrics, which is where I get all kids, young or old, to start. And then we move into bounding, which is more akin to running. So it's an alternating foot striking contact. And then we could get into hopping, which is single leg to single leg. And that's actually the most demanding of the 3 motor skills that are also plyometrics. So I do agree with you in that we can get a lot of bang for our buck doing some of these drills in terms of the combinatory ability. So combinatory ability is a subcategory in coordination where we are combining many joints together versus just isolating, one aspect. Like doing a calf raise, for example, would not be a drill that would help with combinatory ability. It might be a good rehab exercise early stage, but it doesn't really help with the combinatory aspects of movement.
Now, coming back to how we progress plyometrics, you said we can jump longer distances or jump higher. What are some other ways, like maybe adding like med balls, or what are your thoughts on depth jumps and anything else?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, because I tend to have the philosophy of building them into practice conditions, I'll put them in with a speed session. So whether it's multi-directional speed and maybe some accelerations and plyometrics all in the same session, I probably am not really using things like depth and drop jumps because those require athletes to step off of a box and land. I mean, I've had pro athletes do pogo leaps off 2 feet. So that's a ankle dominant exercise off 2 feet that can easily get 45 centimeters off the ground just using their plantar flexors for the most part and the hip. So a leap is a lot of ankle and hip, whereas a hop is more knee. So it does depend. If kids are super healthy, there's no issues, no injuries, I would start them on with leaping, bilateral exercises, and progress them along a continuum to single leg with a bridge in the middle of bounding. Bounding is typically fairly easy to learn, but is not often done very well. So that one is easy to learn, but the kids have trouble over time getting good at that drill, so we just keep drilling it. We just keep drilling it. So I would probably even suggest that coaches pick from the subcategory of plyometric, a few leaping tasks, a few bounding tasks, and a few hopping tasks right off the hop, right off the get-go, and just know that if you're working with physically immature athletes, they're not gonna do any of them very well, but it doesn't mean they can't do them. And I think that for the longest time in strength and conditioning, especially, we always thought plyometrics were this reserved parking spot for, oh my God, you can't do plyometrics until you can squat twice your body weight and until you look like this in the air, until you land exactly like this. Yet kids are sprinting. And we could argue that sprinting is plyometrics. Okay, so I think plyometrics are for everyone and they're for all ages and all levels. And the ability of the person doing them will actually dictate their intensity. So, what I do very crudely is with younger athletes, they do a bit more volume. They do more volume than my professional athletes because my professional athletes are really proficient at them. They can produce a lot of force. They get off the ground really high. So if you're going up off the ground really high, well, then your forces into the ground on landing are gonna be way higher, right? Versus if I'm only hopping off the ground like 5 centimeters, then I'm probably not crashing to the earth very much. So that's how I would progress the drills.
I think that's super helpful for everyone to sort of visualize. So I'll definitely include some video links, also Carmen's social media, so you can also check out some of her drills and the work she's doing. I think this was great to summarize plyometrics. Now I kind of want to shift gears, and this
Sure.
kind of applies to plyometrics is the whole idea of like gait and kinematics. And I think a lot of people
Mm.
get so fixated on these two and they tend to ignore the load management piece of injury reduction and performance enhancement. So let's get into gait versus load management.
That's a great question. I don't think a lot of people are thinking along these lines, Erica, like you are. I think that we often go, my job is to improve speed, so therefore I'm going to teach the mechanics of linear speed. Okay, which is fine, but we want to start with let's talk about what that athlete's doing in their week. Okay, okay, so this athlete has an hour-long agility, quote unquote, workout, whatever that looks like, in the mornings, 2-hour practice in the evening. This goes on 5 days in a row. And the parent or the coach comes to me or to you and says, this athlete doesn't run very well. They look very flat footed. And so when you have the conversation about dose of exercise and dose of high impact exercise, it's not the issue isn't kids, training all the time. Like, it's okay for kids to exercise 6 days a week. Like, in fact, the CSEP guidelines and the ACSM guidelines are an hour a day, I think 5 days a week, right, of exercise. But what we don't necessarily do well is undulate the loads of this exercise. So we keep it really simple. If the human being leaves the earth on the movement, meaning they are running or they are jumping, right away, those tasks go into the highest bucket of load. That's higher load than strength training, than squatting body weight. Because if I squat my body weight, I'm not leaving the ground. I'm not absorbing the ground reaction forces. So in fact, that's at a lower intensity than the sprinting and the jumping. Now, things like mobility and skill work would be the low intensity. So sometimes I'll say to an athlete, okay, can you give me 2 workouts a week where you're maybe just doing your skills, but with no running? So maybe it's a soccer athlete and they're practicing, like, we'll go back to penalty kicks, and they've got somebody, retrieving the ball for them, or the goalie is retrieving the ball and rolling it back to them. So they're really just setting up. It's very, very skill based, and they're not leaving the ground. That's the hard part. So the first thing we need to take off the table is this athlete in a chronic state of fatigue? You know how else we can tell is send them to the physical therapist and get them to give them a treatment hands-on, right? And the physical therapist can tell if there's too much tone in tissue. Tissue that's tired is ropey. Tissue that's tired doesn't move well. It looks more toned when it's at rest. So those are the things that I'm going to look for first, is to see, do I have a healthy athlete? Do I have a rested athlete? Do I have tissue that's ready to be elastic? Or do I have an athlete that's chronically overdosed with the wrong meds and needs actually 2 weeks of active recovery in the pool before we do anything related to gait and speed? So I can't say, Erica, that fatigue 100% changes gait, but when I did my graduate work in university, we did look at, we tracked DOMs in athletes, and they were basketball players, female basketball players, but we tracked their muscle soreness, and the athletes that reported the higher levels of soreness also reported to perceive the workloads as higher. So they felt like, it's like anytime our muscles are really tired and sore, whatever we go to do is going to feel worse than it actually is, right? We've all done that. We've gone up a set of stairs after we've done like a lot of sprinting, and the legs just feel like we need some help getting up there. So we don't want kids to get used to that feeling, right? We want kids to feel like their body's ready to compete and ready to train. And there's times of the year when we can push, and we can, but we do that with Olympic athletes. We do that prior to the World Championships. And we do that prior to the Olympic Games. Like when I used to work with Canadian wrestlers in the USA national girls, and I have 5 world medalists I've trained, I look at what we would do prior to a major event, and then afterwards, they'd be off the mats for a month, resting and recovering. And some of these kids were university age. They weren't, they weren't in their late 20s. They were 18, 19 years old. So, some sports do a great job of tapering and listening to the kids, and tracking load and tracking wellness, and then other sports. And I'd say soccer for sure is in the dark ages of it. It's actually, I just know this just based on, like, flipping conversations with people. They don't know. Mm.
That's fascinating with the muscle soreness and the gait, and I can definitely see that fatigue manifesting physically, and we're not getting the most out of a running mechanic session. But I wonder, is there also something to the mental side of it? Because mechanics is skill acquisition, and it's like, well, if a kid is constantly fatigued, how are they able to acquire new skills and pick up on new things in their sprinting form? Is there anything on that?
There is, way outside of my wheelhouse. I had a client that just sent me, a zipped file full of articles in that very area that I'll be tackling over the break. But there are people that study mental fatigue and its association with performance, much better than I do. I would probably safe bet to say that there's certainly a relationship between the two. There's it's hard to just say, oh, that person is suffering from central nervous system fatigue, because it's hard to measure. It's not like we can go around and start measuring like the receptor sensitivity and acetylcholine and things like that, just day to day, or start like doing MRIs on people. But I think with kids, generally what happens when they're really tired is they get irritable. That's like the first one, is mood disorders. I was talking with Laurie Primo's, the head of track at the university here, and that's what he said. And he's been coaching track and has worked with the gentleman down at Altus for years, that when kids are really stressed physically with high intensity work. And remember, high intensity is high forces, it's not the burn, right? Like, people are like, oh, I had a high intensity workout, I did like 50,000 air squats, and then my answer is, oh wow, there's no honor in that, right? Because there's no load. It's intense, but it's not, it just feels intense because it burns. And we really need to get the fitness scene out of sport. Okay. If people want to do 50,000 air squats and they don't play sports, that's totally fine. But the way that athletes are developed couldn't be more different.
Now, can you talk a little bit about gait versus load management in the ACL rehab space?
Sure. Okay. So with ACL rehab, I use something called a gait component approach, which, to be fully transparent, is something I invented, because when I went into the literature, Erica, I was a bit disappointed, is to say it politely, at what physical therapists were doing with respect to clearing someone to run. Okay. In other words, there is no criteria. One of the studies I read literally said, if an athlete can leg press 1.5 times their body weight on one leg, they're ready to run. That's like, it's like telling a parent that has an infant that if they can use a spoon or use their hand, let's say, and feed themselves blueberries, they're ready to run. Like, there's actually very little relationship between the two. So what I do in rehab and in my course is I teach clinicians and strength and conditioning coaches. I even had a soccer coach in my last cohort, which was awesome. Um, Start them in the pool with the athlete and get them to start walking in the pool, get them to start doing things like marching, analyze the sport. If the sport requires some lateral movement, jockeying type movements, galloping, all those movements can be done in water. So getting away from this idea that it's some type of milestone that we need to start jogging. Another thing we need to remember is that jogging, not running and sprinting, but jogging, the ground reaction force is about 2 to 3 times body weight. So again, going from exercises that have zero body, like only body weight, so 1 times body weight, to 2 to 3 times, there's just a big jump. So in between that, we get in the pool, we do all our exercises in there for about a month and a half, and then we get the athletes out of the pool, we get them on land, we start marching on land. Then we start doing track and field dribbles, which are kind of a hybrid drill between upright sprinting and plyometrics. And we build volume on dribbles because the displacement, which is the amount the body moves up and down, is very minimal in dribbling, which lessens the ground reaction forces and bridges the gap between walking and actually jogging. And then once athletes can handle pretty high volumes of dribbling, then they can start accelerating. I just skip the jogging stage altogether with athletes, because athletes can jog. Like, once they can sprint and accelerate, they can jog. Like, we don't need to work on jogging. And I don't have time, right? I have however many months or time period to get kids back. I have a kid I'm working with now. She's 6 months post-op, and her coach is like, do you think she'll be ready in March, for playoffs kind of thing. So it's like, all right, maybe, I don't know, but we're working towards something, and it's not jogging. Yeah.
I think a lot of people probably find that shocking, but I do want you to plug your ACL rehab course that people can learn more about this and just kind of hear something new, because I think, like you mentioned, for so many years we looked at the rehab literature and it's just not correct. So plug your
Yeah.
course.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that the challenge is that there's just not enough research done, and case study research is good research where we just take one person and we track them like over a period of time. And so that's one of the ways that my course evolved was I had rehabbed so many people with great success, and I don't know, I got a physio friend that said, "You should just turn this into a course." Then, of course, when you make the course, it's like you writing a book, you also need to back up everything that you're doing with evidence, so it's very scientific, but the course is, it's online. It's 8 weeks kind of in duration, and I say that because the last cohort was like, "Can we have access to the course for longer? We're still working on it." Apparently, there's a lot of material, so I've totally let it open for a month after it was supposed to close, and that's fine because my goal is to educate as many people. So those people could be physical therapists, they could be strength and conditioning coaches. I'm inviting sport coaches to come so they understand the rehab process because I do get into the very end of it talks about returning to play. Believe it or not, returning to play or returning to sport is 50% of the rehab. So we get to usually around 6 months with physical therapists or maybe even less than that. Then it's mostly return to sport. And what does that look like? Like, I had an athlete. When can I start practicing with my team? Said you can start practicing with your team now, but these are the drills you're allowed to do. And I make a list, right? But I understand the demands of the sport. So in something like soccer, I'd say, okay, you can practice if you're only playing offense. You're in control of the ball. You're not doing any decelerations, and you're not reading and reacting to an opponent, right? Or you can work on these skills. And we can if we can get kids back into their sport environment as soon as possible in a very safe way, you know what that does for their mental health, right? When you're a team sport athlete and you feel like you can't all of a sudden something's been taken away from you without your control, and then all of a sudden you're now no longer in your daily training environment, even if it's like not at a super competitive level, you're on the B team or whatever, and you're 17. These are your girlfriends or your guy friends. These are the people you bond with, the people that know everything about you, maybe more than your parents do at that point because you're a teenager, right? So if we can get these kids back in those environments, my one of my clients would go to practice every day, and I gave her a whole bunch of drills just to do, like, on the sidelines. While the team was doing what they're doing, she was doing all of her rehab drills, but she was there 3 days a week, and she's in great spirits, and she's feeling really confident with the whole process. Not necessarily because I've given her, like, the most amazing drills, which maybe I have, but anyway, but she's doing them well, but she's in her daily training, which that makes me happy and it makes her happy. So I'm pumped about that. So yes, anyone can take the course that's interested in this process. And it's online. So if people are too busy to sit in on the lectures, even though I still offer a live lecture once a week, everything's recorded. All the homework's in the back end of the website. It's all there. And everything's video based. So all the plyometric stuff, Erica, I just talked about. I have a coaching plyometrics section with every drill. How to do it, what to look for, what the dosages should be. And I even went as far as to create cheat sheets throughout the entire course. So in every module, clinicians and coaches can download summary of everything I went through to put on their bulletin board. So if someone is at early stage rehab, these are the things they should be doing. These are the no-nos. This is the exit criteria before they move to the next stage, stuff like that. So try to summarize things for people because we're busy, right? And sometimes physical therapists will have like 12 ACL patients at a time. And it's an epidemic, as you know. The youth market, and I hate to call it that, is the biggest in the world right now, or at least in North America. Like youth are falling like trees with ACLs. And I don't want to see them to repeat it, right? And the youth side is a higher percentage of re-injury too. It's upwards to closer to 40%, whereas the professional athletes is closer to 25% re-injury, which is unacceptable. That just tells me the rehab's probably incomplete. Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been seeing a lot of problems with re-injury and just poorly managed rehab programs and just not enough preparation for the higher velocities in the game and returning to sport. So I encourage everyone to check out Carmen's course. I mean, I would even go as far as to say parents should check it out. So if you have a daughter who's going through an ACL rehab right now, educate yourself and be an advocate for her and question the PT and just continue to ask questions. So I'll leave that in the caption below, as well as Carmen's social media handles. So please follow up with her. She has so much great information out there. And again, you're just going to get a lot more from her courses, because with all the drills she mentioned in this episode, is you'll be able to see the videos and the technique and the volume and progression. So definitely check those out. Carmen, thanks again.
Thank
And
you.
everyone, I will see you on the next episode.